You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to exploring innovative minds and adding life to your years. And now, your host, scientist Rick Croneiss.
Welcome. It's good to have you back today. I have a fun guest, as usual. Dr. Herman Pontzer of Duke University is on today. He's an evolutionary anthropologist. He got his PhD in biological anthropology at Harvard and has some really interesting ideas that have been around. Many of you have heard of him. In fact, many of you reached out and talked about him as a potential guest down the road. But his constrained energy expenditure hypothesis and some of the papers related to that have been very interesting and talked about out there. We actually referenced some of his work in metabolic winter hypothesis, and so there's a lot of shared background. And so really during the last 10 years, as he's been expanding his work, it parallels what we did, David Sinclair, Andrew Bremer, and I, on our side of this. What's really interesting about this and what might unwind in our conversation today is how we've approached this energetic constraint from both a dietary perspective and from the exercise perspective, or as I'm always say, is the wiggling and the swallowing side of this. But what's really interesting about his research is that he went past the simple calorie in, calorie out ideas and wanted to understand how the ecology, the lifestyle, the diet, and the evolutionary history affect metabolism and health. And in doing so, he's looking deeper than that simple idea. So even in his work with Hadza, measuring them directly as hunter-gatherers, he's not just playing into the common narrative, but in fact, if you read some of his work out there, you'll find that they were surprised when they proposed and did the doubly labeled water methods, that the metabolism of these hunter-gatherers was actually no different than the couch potatoes and the office workers here in the US or worldwide. So I think you're going to have a lot of fun listening to our dialogue since we haven't had a scientific conversation, just some basic back and forth on some emails. That conversation will roll out. So he's going to learn some about our research real time, and I'm going to learn more about his real time. So it should be fun to see how this all rolls out. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Herman Ponster to our show today. Welcome, Herman. Welcome to Science and Saucery. I can't wait to have this conversation. You've been a huge request out there from people that wanted me to have this conversation with you because we talk a lot about the same things.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great. And if I had to summarize what I love most about your work, like if not to bury the lead, but to just put it right out there for the audience, the first is that despite conventional wisdom that seems to put energy balance all on wiggling, exercise, it turns out we're fairly efficient biological machines, and paradoxically, the traditional hunter-gatherer, or gathering hunter as I call them, and the modern couch potato are surprisingly similar in energy expenditure. But the second point, which I love more than anything, is your idea that life is simply a game of turning energy into kids. When I read that the first time from you, and I don't even remember when, it stuck so well. So it's just so poetic to get this conversation going. And I hope to circle back to this interrelationship of fecundity and longevity. But let's dive first into your passion. Can you share with the audience a little bit about your background and sort of let's take some time to just really move them into your research and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me on. When I went to, it's just the beginning of the fall semester here at Duke where I'm teaching. And every fall, I think for the past I don't know, 15 years now. I've been teaching the class that got me excited about science. So it's a real treat to do that. It's this Introduction to Human Evolution course. And I love to teach this class because I get to relive vicariously this experience I had as an undergraduate, where I just got my eyes just opened to the science, the field of human evolution, and trying to understand in some kind of real way, where we came from, how our bodies became the way they are today, how they're shaped, how they work today, understanding our own selves, and then, of course, life on Earth from an evolutionary lens. It was just so profoundly eye-opening. And that tracked me into a career. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I got to college, but it tracked me into a career in human evolutionary studies. And so, I was always interested in energetics and efficiency and how you take resources and turn them into offspring, because that's kind of where the rubber hits the road in evolution. And I've always drawn to that. And so, I did a work in my graduate career looking at the energetics of locomotion, developing mathematical models to predict how many calories you burn when you walk and run and how that's related to your anatomy. And then after grad school, I thought, okay, well, now we're going to let's blow this up, and let's think, not just about movement, which is a big part of any animal's life, including our own species, but let's think about the entire energy budget. And let's think about how our bodies burn calories, all those calories that we burn 24 hours a day, where do they go? How are they burned? How does that work? And how does our body, if we think about ourselves as this evolved system with balancing multiple organ systems and multiple tasks and multiple goals, how does that all get balanced and work? And we knew, I knew that we would have to do this with a hunting and gathering group, because humans, our lineage has been hunting and gathering since before we were us. Our species as Homo sapiens, we only get going about 300,000 years ago, but our genus, the genus Homo, is about 2 million years old, 2.5 million years old. And the genus Homo, all that 2.5 million years, is a hunting and gathering genus. That's our strategy. That's where we come from. That's what's shaped the last 2.5 million years of our evolution. And so if we want to understand how our bodies work, and I think fundamental to that is understanding how our bodies burn calories, then we wanted to understand it in that kind of a system. And luckily for us, there are a small handful of populations left on this earth that are still hunting and gathering. And so I had two great colleagues, Brian Wood and Dave Reichlin, and was able to go. Brian Wood has been working with one of these populations called the Hadza in Tanzania for decades now. And us three were able to get funding and go and measure energy expenditures in hunter-gatherers. And the results were really surprising, because here we go. We know we're going to go into this hunting and gathering population, really physically active. We know that their energy expenditures are going to be so wildly different than us in the West, in this developed world that we live in, we built for ourselves. And the results from that study were so surprising that it has become, since 2010 when we did that study, that's become my new, scientific passion, is understanding how energetics works, because it totally wasn't the way we expected.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I began my work when I moved over to this part of it, understanding the mechanisms, because I was getting results that did not match the model of swallowing and wiggling, just to say it in the simple way, that I was taught or that I came to believe. And I realized, because in fact, I'm very envious that you're Duke, because I worked with David and Jane Richardson when I was at NASA. One of the things I was doing is protein crystal growth. So I came out there and did a sabbatical up there. So we were just looking at protein folding, if you know their lab, and looking at how you change the hydrophobicity or philicity of surface residues and how those proteins fold. And that's an energy minimization kind of problem too. So I've done a lot of work in the past with that. And when I looked at it, there were these big giant holes, and I'm like, how can we not understand this? And why it's so exciting that you're digging into this is that my sort of introduction into this world was via Nate Dominy.
Oh, sure.
Up at Dartmouth. He wasn't at Dartmouth then, but he moved to Dartmouth. And so I went up there and listened in on a couple of his classes as well. And he helped me map out I would say, what my raw ideas were, but he helped me hang them on the sort of evolutionary human framework. And he's just fascinating. If you've met him, or he's just an amazing guy.
Oh, he's
like
a friend.
You.
I know Nate very well. Yeah, sure.
He really helped me put this into proper perspective, and it was great to be able to do that. And ever since then, it colored my view of what this is all about, working on this idea of this creature that evolved in a world of scarcity. In a world of scarcity, appetite isn't a trait of negative selection. It's a good thing. And the fact that we have it today and food is just unnaturally abundant, like we end the metabolic winter hypothesis, the only species that are obese and chronically ill are us and the ones we keep warm and chronically overfed. And they get exactly the same little doggy diabetes and heart disease and et cetera that we do. And, winter never comes. This idea that we believe that the constant grow of anabolism, which is profitable for the food industry, profitable for medical industry, profitable for fitness and results, profitable for sports. Metabolic summer, warm, bright, active, and abundant. Supplements, it drives chronic overnutrition. I don't think it's a conspiracy, and I don't think they're evil corporations. I just think like it's a natural thing. Whereas when we look at metabolic winter of cool, dark, still, and scarce, which I think then underpins what you're looking at in your bigger idea of energy conservation and the fact that there is this constant balance that's going on. I think that really supports that idea. So tell people a little bit about your theory of this and how this played out in your research.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning, we went to the population called the Hadza in northern Tanzania, and they are incredibly physically active. And so based on the kind of, standard education that one gets in how metabolism works, the standard model, we expected them to be burning lots more calories than we do in the West. That's, because they're so much more physically active. And what we found, we actually measured energy expenditures there using a technique called the doubly labeled water method, which is this physiological measurement of energy expenditure. So it's a real hard measure, is that they actually burn the same number of calories every day as your standard American or standard European, in a much more sedentary, coddled lifestyle. And that was really shocking for us. And we didn't expect to see that at all. We expected, of course, the entire grant that we wrote to go out and do the work was predicated on this idea that we'd find higher expenditures.
By the way, when you were doing that, not to interrupt, but while you're doing that, what I want to do with Nate was go down there about the same time and prove exactly that, because I don't know if he's published that data, but he had some data that he collected where he looked at people that were just inside hunting, gathering still, and then the others that came out and were a bit agrarian, right at the edge where they've been forced by the governments to move out. And what he surprisingly found was the agrarian society was expending more energy than the actual hunter-gatherers. That was a more efficient way to do it. My expectation was going to be that. I was at the time prodding all the paleo types and all the people with five-toe shoes thinking they're going to go out and emulate the past. And I learned my lesson in Biosphere 2, that simply emulating what you think nature is not always the best way to understand it, because inherent in your view of what a hunter-gatherer is like you had this implicit bias that was, of course they're more active. We're couch potatoes. But that's just something we've made up, because until you measured it, really no one measured it in that way.
Yeah. Well, so, the thing is, they are incredibly more active. We've measured that with accelerometers. We've measured the wiggling.
Right.
And they wiggle like crazy, but they don't burn more calories. So that was just a big surprise. And, I think, yourself coming from kind of outside this field, your expectations were different, and, saw it as a more of kind of a dynamically stable system, I think. And I think that's right. That makes sense. I can tell you that coming at it as an evolutionary anthropologist, not trained in the kind of NIH metabolism, labs, but coming at it as an evolutionary anthropologist from a more, evolutionary biology perspective, when we saw this data, we weren't, so it's funny. We were shocked by it because we expected it all.
Right.
And as we drilled down on it more, we realized how much more interesting this was, because when we went and I talked to people who have actually spent their lives measuring energy expenditures, So we collaborated at the time. We do this in our own lab now, but at the time we were collaborating with the doubly labeled water lab out of Baylor, one of the best in the country, best in the world. And I said, look at this result. It's Bill Wong there at Baylor. I said, Bill, what's going on? And he goes, oh, well, we see this, they're more efficient. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, they're burning fewer calories than you expect. And I said, no. You've just described what you've just you just called it efficiency, but what's actually happening that these people are burning fewer calories than anybody would expect? Well, it didn't really have an answer. And I got that kind of same answer several times from different people who have, again, spent lifetimes doing this and are very good at it, but just weren't, I don't know what it was, the bias or just the training or what they found interesting maybe. They weren't interested in drilling down on how this was happening. At the same time, I should say, we were measuring energy expenditures in a bunch of different primate populations because, if you're an evolutionary anthropologist, then humans are great. But, if you want to understand the whole family, the whole system, then you have this ability to kind of branch outside and say, well, how do other species of primates do this, And so we were doing this comparative work. And around the same time that we had the Hadza stuff came out, we had a nice study coming out looking at energy expenditure of populations of primates. And some of them we measured in zoos and some were measured in the wild. And again, primates in the zoo, which clearly are not as active as primates in the wild, burn the same number of calories for their body size as animals, in the wild. So that was an eye opener. And then, look across species, you see this again and again and again. So this is evolution being very clever and very dynamic, and you'd expect it to be, and basically not running up the tab, right?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, as you're saying, from an outside perspective. And hearing it, that's exactly what I did with health span and longevity with David Sinclair. I was doing this mild cold stress, and so I'm giving this talk, and David and I met at TED Med first time, and he said, hey, Ray, this has a lot more implications than just energy expenditure and weight loss. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're really underselling this. I think you should dig deeper because we even see in mice that we've had to go back and look at data because when they were in a cool lab, there was part of that upregulation of what we now know as the sirtuin genes that seemed to be a part of the process. And this is where we came up with the metabolic winter hypothesis. And he said, I'd love to write a paper with you on it. Let's dig in on this. But what's really great about this is that what you're now seeing, now that you're measuring, is that this idea or modern notion that we compare calories in and calories out on a daily basis. I mean, we wouldn't manage our metabolic checking account that way. We wouldn't say you can't write a check greater than what you deposited today. We would say, what is your account balance? And we as a whole in the research community, because of the convenience of the experiments and because we're trying to control, this is maybe a little bit of Einstein's spooky action at a distance, right? With our finger in the pot. But what we unintentionally do is constrain that problem such that we're looking at the in and outs, and probably based on food scarcity and eating, it's far more dynamic over much more time than that, a bigger time scale. And it's just hard to study humans with controlled food and controlled energy over a long period of time. And an unintended thing that I stumbled into is because I fix as a constraint for my clients, what they're eating is fixed, but I don't manage them. I don't tell them eat this much of it. The scale tells them that. But at the same time, I tell them don't do any activity at all. Zero, as little as you possibly can. And I sent you a little graph, which nobody else will see at this point, but I sent you a little graph. And what's really amazing is that no matter what I've done on myself, as I've watched my energy go down in consumption, all the way down to water-only fasting for 24 days. I don't think you can get any less input than that, right? But when I measured my metabolism every day, it scaled exactly with the Harris-Benedict's equation. And yeah, we can tweak those things a little bit, et cetera. But that's pretty interesting to be that close. And what ends up happening, because no researcher normally, you're not going to go normally get an NIH grant and say, we're going to lock a bunch of people in a room and they're not going to eat for 24 days and we're going to study energy. Well, I just think there's this entire obsession with deficiency that was probably very important when food was economically scarce. But then back to this question I want to throw back to you as an anthropologist.
Yeah.
How in the world do animals do it? I mean, if it really is this difficult to get a balanced diet, and if that's really the thing that everybody's constantly focused on, make sure you get all this stuff, which I believe is just an offshoot of food advertising that goes back to the turn of the century in USDA. But that aside, from a scientific perspective, every study we construct is constrained by that. And what you're seeing in nature is not. Nobody was worrying about the nutritional adequacy of what those guys were doing, or in many cases, in the primate studies, in the wild for sure. But let's just face it, we see this in dietary studies with primates, and what we've seen from yeast to primate is dietary restriction without malnutrition, i.e. superfluous calories and superfluous nutrition, not with too much focus on the calorie there. Superfluous nutrition might be those signals for these adaptive mechanisms that you've discussed under the constrained energy expenditure hypothesis.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, you're right, though. I don't think we have it drilled. We don't have it sorted out yet exactly what's happening under the hood.
Right.
A few things about that that you brought up that I think are really interesting. One is, you're absolutely right that most, certainly the people I've worked with, the hunter-gatherer groups and other, we have a group up in Kenya that we work with now. And, I have lots of friends who work with small-scale populations all over the globe. They don't worry about, new vitamins and minerals and that kind of stuff. They don't, but they can't help but get them is the point. They aren't bombarded with, really nutrient poor foods that are they're never at risk of not getting enough vitamin C, for example, because they're eating enough whole wild foods. They're going to get all the things that they need. I think that we probably do sort of, this whole issue about, what's the RDA, what's the recommended daily allowance of all these things. I don't think anybody pays attention to them anyway, except for nutritionists.
Right.
And so I don't know how valuable they are as sort of guidelines, but there's a lot of people who think that the nutritional guidelines that are given are the reason that everybody's overweight. And I have to laugh at that because, I don't know anybody who could even tell you what the nutritional guidelines are, much less follows them.
Right.
Anyway, that's a separate question. But you're, the question of like, well, how do we deal with activity and diet intake and this issue of calorie balance and energy balance? There's a lot of issues and a lot of like problems with how that's all handled, and especially in the kind of the research world. One of the ones I come up against a lot is that there's this assumption that we know how many calories people are eating, or that we know how many calories people are expending without measuring them, right? So to measure energy expenditure on a 24-hour basis, you actually need either to lock somebody in a room, or you need to do something like doubly labeled water, where you can actually, you're not just resting expenditure, but you're measuring the entire day's expenditure, something like that. What we do now, the state of the art right now for a lot of these studies is just to measure activity level.
Mm-hmm.
Well, activity level tells you, it tells you about activity, but it doesn't tell you about calories.
Or the source of the calories, because we have multiple sources. Right. So which tank are you pulling from? It tells you
nothing about RQ. That's right. And
nothing about
and then
RQ.
If you ask people what they eat, so much of what of the energy intake side of things is just asking people.
They have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, people miss the best data I know on this is that people miss about 30% of their calories. Well, if you're a typical American eating 3 meals a day, that means you've forgotten a meal. Well, how useful is that? If we can't even get you within closer to 70% of the calories, then it's a joke. So, so what we think we know is, I know the history of this. The way that people, if you go to an online calorie calculator and ask how many calories do I burn every day, it'll ask you how much you weigh, and it'll take that weight and it'll estimate your basal metabolic rate, and then it'll ask you how active you are,
right.
And
1.3, 1.5,
Exactly.
1.7.
And you lie and you say how active you are, and it gives you a calorie count, right? Well, that approach is based in post-World War II. People like Ansel Keys freaking out and really worried about, what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in all these the horrors of World War II, and trying to grapple with how do you provide proper nutrition and understand how many the calorie needs of these populations that have been just war torn. And then going forward, how do we do this internationally as we kind of, the UN gets going and we had this international push to try to provide nutritional assistance to these different populations. And they had no way to measure 24-hour energy expenditures. There was no technology that could do it.
Not only that, but we're talking about people that were back to our metabolic bank account, they were at a spending deficit. They had gone past their fat stores. So I think Ansel Keys did amazing work. I don't like how he's been maligned, but what I can say is that people trying to express, people who started at 145, 135, 5'9", and then they took them down to below that to mimic exactly what you're saying. What do you do when someone's in this kind of situation, truly below the neutral level, and compare that to somebody who's 40, 50, or 100 pounds overweight, whose balance is full? And the idea that we have to eat the storage organ of another plant, say an underground storage organ, like a tuber bulb, corm, or rhizome, or an animal, the fat and bacon, to burn our own energy storage organ, to me, from the outside, that's ludicrous. It's ludicrous to think that swallowing has anything to do with those activities, but it's also just as ridiculous, I think, as you're saying, or let's just say naive, because I don't think they are intending to do that. I think we've misappropriated what their work is in the diet industry. That someone who is beyond normal fat level and someone who's extremely over, that's going to be a real issue. And then one has to ask back to these control mechanisms that's what's most exciting about your work, about how do we get to the next step? How would one construct in nature a diet that was completely nutritionally balanced and calorically restricted? How do you pull that off? And the answer, back to what you were saying with these Hosda and other people, it probably isn't. So, hey, might it be that restricted nutrition is what our body is signaling on? Is it possibility that those essential amino acids that everybody's obsessed about, because they've got this word protein that they don't even really understand what it means? Even my scientific colleagues don't understand it. They can understand it at the molecular level on beta sheets and alpha helix, coils, but they can't understand it on a nutritional level, that protein isn't a thing. It's not a thing. There's these essential amino acids. And how would you construct a diet that was limited in food and not restrict those? And might those be signaling? Might nutrition restriction? Because there's like 80 years of dietary restriction experiments that suggest that's true. In fact, I don't know of any where we fed them more of something and they lived longer. This is not just a little bit true.
Point. Yeah.
So how can these not be together? And this is, again, why I believe that what you have here with this constrained energy expenditure hypothesis is just that it makes sense that our bodies prioritize that. And the only reason we're not allowed to look at it more carefully is because we took this dearth of data that came out from people who were nutritionally on the other side and said, this is a now floor to where we can do responsible research. This is post-Nuremberg code, you know? And so the only place this can be done are people like me I'm not tied to that. I can do whatever I want with my midlife crisis calorimeter in my garage, right? I can do what I want. And this is what David said was exciting, what I hope we could do in work as well. But this idea that I don't know what I can't do. And another person who's a mentor of mine, another podcast, was Burt Rutan, who's the guy who did the Voyager that went nonstop around the world and Spaceship One. But what he taught me was this confidence in nonsense and not knowing something. It's not about doing something crazy, but you got to be able to push against that. And unfortunately, when you know something, when you've learned it, it's really hard not to invoke that in your solution set. And that's what happened with
right.
Andrew on diabetes, and what I think you did as an anthropologist. So forget me for a second. What you did coming in as an anthropologist, it's that you didn't know that you couldn't do it. And that's what was most exciting when your work started coming out. Because when we were doing metabolic one-third hypothesis and oxidative priority, we talked about your work then.
Mm-hmm.
It was, this is coming in this direction, and it doesn't seem unreasonable. And it seemed to be, and again, my input was Nate, it seemed to be consistent with evolutionary biology.
Yeah. And, thinking about, again, like you said, what's the norm? How do we sort of, is it the Overton window? How do we sort of frame things and what we think of as normal or what we think of as a given? Two things that come up again and again. One is, in my work and when I talk to colleagues, one is this idea, again, that the approach that we use to estimate people's metabolisms, based on their activity, that's cooked in, that's baked into the way that people think about things now. And so it is even though it was never anything other than an educated guess.
Yes.
It has become how people just understand metabolism, and that's just it. And so it's really hard to push back against that. And then the other thing is that what is the normal human, right? What's a normal healthy human? And I think, you were just speaking to this, which is when we ask, well, what's normal for a human? What's the normal physiology? What's the normal blood glucose level? What's the normal BMI? And, we the way that that's happened is that the people doing the medical research have looked around and said, this guy looks healthy. Looks normal to me, and so that's become normal, but that's not normal at all. What's normal in terms of our evolved physiology is going to be the physiology that we see in these small scale societies where people are eating, they're eating unprocessed foods because they don't have access to processed foods, and they're really active all day because that's what life is like. And I don't think that we want to go out and sort of cosplay as hunter-gatherers. That's not the point. But we want to ask, okay, what are the sort of normative values for our physiology that we should use as a reference? It's not, it's not the 18-year-old college student who just shows up to volunteer for a study.
Right.
It should be we should have a kind of broader window than that. And I think actually that also ends up being a way to think about, how do we understand how these mechanisms of efficiency work and where the body's, where is it finding the calories? So that's been kind of the side branch of this work, finding that energy expenditure is kind of the same no matter who you look at and what kind of lifestyle you have. That must mean that there are these trade-offs happening where there's, we've measured walking costs with the Hadza. They're the same as you and me. So it isn't like they're magically more efficient in movement. Mm-hmm. So they must, if they have the same calorie expenditure as you and me, or the typical American, let's say, and they're much more physically active. Okay, well, you're a physicist. That movement you can't get movement for free. Mm-hmm. And that their muscles aren't far more efficient than ours because we picked that up when we measured walking costs, so we never see it. Okay, well, then they must be doing less of something else. In fact, they must be doing less of a lot of other things. And we are starting to dig into this now. We don't have the answers here, but I can tell you that if you look at, for example, testosterone and estrogen levels, so the sex steroid hormones, right? They're about half of the levels in the Hadza that we'd see in a Western population. Right. If you look at inflammation levels, baseline inflammation levels, they're lower. If you look at, well, we don't know this yet, but we know from people who put the Hadza, but we know from people who are regular exercisers, if you look at stress-free activity, right? How much of an epinephrine bump do you get, and how much a cortisol bump do you get when you're stressed? And we're constantly getting stressed, right? you have a much lower bump.
And they're getting stressed in their world too. It's just a different physiological response.
Yeah, they're not over responding, right? They're not, the 4-alarm fire doesn't go off every time they hear something or get pushed. And so they're saving calories on these things. And guess what? Well, hey, if you now we've sort of, it's like we've gone east by sailing west. Now you ask, okay, well, how should I go to your doctor and ask them, how do I prevent cardiovascular disease? How do I fix my chronic disease? And they say, well, you want to lower your stress and you want to make sure you don't get too much inflammation, and you want to how do I avoid cancers that are, the sexual, sex can, what's the word for it? Reproductive cancers is what I'm trying to say. How do we avoid reproductive cancers? Well, we're not sure, but probably having sky high estrogen and testosterone levels isn't great. Fine. So this is, again, what's the normal human? Well, the normal human is the one who has all those things in a healthy range, because that's, of course it is. Of course, that's the normal situation, because animals aren't evolved to get massive amounts of cancer and heart disease and be obese. I mean, it's not how it works.
Or to compete in marathons.
But yeah, that either, honestly. That's true.
So in other words, I'm not saying that activity isn't important as part of a healthy lifestyle, but what I'm saying is, and this is so hard, the fact that I have to always qualify it is indicative of the bias we inherently have here. But, you invoking the Overton window, I've got to remember that, because that's a great point, and I want to make sure I remember that in the future. But this idea that what is normal today and chronic overnutrition is normal, and if you think about it, back to the second point that I really loved about what you said, that the idea that life is simply a game of turning energy into kids, what's really interesting is it takes 0 to 15 or so to reach reproductive age, right? And then 15 to 20 years of reproductive prime. And then let's just tack on there, we'll put away grandmother hypothesis for a minute and pack on another, say, 15 years to raise your youngest offspring, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere around 45 or 50, evolution's done with you. And where do we see the chronic disease? We see it kicking in after that point. Where is the feedback loop? There isn't a feedback loop, because your reproduction, your genes are already passed on. And so in looking at this and then comparing that with the unbelievable amount of information we have from yeast to primates, where we see fecundity and longevity being inversely related, or fecundity and health span in the longer lived organisms like primates, right? What we see is that paradoxically, when we reduce calories, and I say calories there not because that matters, but let's just say when we reduce nutrition to get it more focused of what our discussion is today, to move this beyond the old calorie model that I think you're doing a great job of doing. When we reduce that nutrition by 30 to 40%, the organism paradoxically lives 50% longer, or has more health span if they're longer lived organisms like primates. And we haven't seen many exceptions to that. And I think what makes a good argument from an anthropology perspective is, during times of scarcity, fecundity is downregulated. That makes sense. And the organism's preserved for a time when offspring, turning energy into kids once again, is the prime directive. Okay, that's a just so story. There's a lot to unpack there in terms of you and I proving that. But as a reasonable first guess, that's way better than everyone's dying and having heart attacks and everything because the food is so poisoned and and they're not getting enough nutrition, and that somehow they're missing out on their K vitamins or missing out on B12. The idea that people are dying of nutritional deficiency in the post-economic abundance of food is probably not it's probably a way less accurate just so story. Yeah,
I mean, I will say, I'm a scientist. I'm a data person. I know you are too. So I don't know the nutritional. I don't know the vitamin intake data as well as you do. But I would, I'm sympathetic to that view for sure. And I think that
people aren't dying of rickets. People aren't dying of scurvy.
That's right.
Right. I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm saying that there is a limit to its importance, just like exercise. What I feel like you've done for activity, we've done already in nutrition. In other words, I feel like your work has moved the bar, even though neither one of our works completely describe it. We both would be hardcore skeptics and say there's a lot of what ifs in what we're saying. But on whole, you've moved exercise into the realm where at least people can just talk about the idea of everybody going out and wiggling more as the reason they're overweight, or the reason, like, I don't want to tell people that are carrying around my clients. I've sent you some pictures. You've seen what those changes are. Yeah. My last podcast, the one from last week, 110 pounds in 149 days. Very healthy. All of his biomarkers are perfect now. He feels amazing. What I'm saying though is that 110 pounds he was carrying around, gets back to the riddle, which weighs more, 100 pounds of steel or 100 pounds of fat, right? And these personal trainers would all say this person needed to go wiggle more knee injuries, doesn't feel good in tight clothing, doesn't want to be sweating. His whole life was carrying around 110 pounds. I'd like to take one of those guys with 6-pack abs and say, here, strap on 110 pounds and just live life all the time. If that's not exercise, what is it? And so, bringing it back to this point where I feel like you've moved the bar really is that, yes, we know what certain nutrients deficiencies result in certain pathophysiology. We have those connections. And that's not what people are mostly dying of. People are dying of chronic overnutrition, excess lipids, excess sugar, excess amino acids in the diet, not deficiency. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist in third worlds or whatever. That's not the point. But at the same time, we have a very similar and parallel story going on that is connecting activity to that via the concept of a calorie. And I don't believe people are dying of lack of activity. And I feel like your data supports that.
Yeah, I mean, what I always tell folks is that, when the positive work first came out and we said, look, they're more active, but not burning more calories, we got hammered. We got hammered because people said, and this didn't help that a lot of the, clickbaity journalists who covered it had this as their headlines, don't bother exercising.
Right. That's what they do to me all the time.
And I said, we actually have every time we talk to anybody, and I'll say it to you as well, we're not saying on exercise, we're saying exercise doesn't do what you think it does. Doesn't help you lose weight. What it does, there are good things for exercise, keeping your blood vessels happy. I think that regular physical activity is sort of probably a coordinating signal that helps your body kind of, again, what is the normal human physiology? Well, I think it's a physiology that has a fair amount of activity. The jute factory studies from, I'm going to forget the guy's name, starts with an M, from the 1950s. Do you know this fun work?
Yes.
Yeah. And, let me finish my first thought first, which is what I like to tell people now, if they ask, is that we have to think about exercise and diet as two different tools for two different jobs, right? All your weight management and a lot of your cardiometabolic health, it's going to be all diet. And, in terms of fitness and keeping your blood vessels happy and a lot of other stuff, you can have to exercise. So you kind of, in my view, you're not off the hook for one or the other.
Right.
And that's a different question about how do you lose weight? That's a different question. But, how do you sort of, when you're at your maintenance state and you want to stay healthy, I think you have to be looking at both diet and exercise together. But as separate tools. Anyway, so the jute study I love because for folks who don't know, they did this big, massive study in this in a jute factory in the 1950s in India, and they had, it's a large number, it's hundreds of people, all men, because that's the nature of the factory work at the time in the 50s in India, and they had people with different jobs, and some of the jobs were really physically taxing. They were cutting and hauling bales of jute. Some folks were, kind of in the middle. They were walking around the factory floor, checking on stuff, managing projects. And they had these stall holders whose job was to basically be a barnacle, and they just sat glued to a chair, 8 or 10 hours a day, just doing, bureaucratic work. And if you look at the weight of these guys, and you've seen this study, if you look at the weight of these guys, everybody's the same except the stall managers who are just stuck to their chair. And this isn't my own take on this. I know other people have said this as well, but I am sympathetic to the idea that everybody else had enough physical activity that they were able to maintain a relatively normal physiology, and their diet and their hunger and satiety signals were talking to each other in a way that kept them at a stable weight. You take the person who is probably unhappy and stuck on a chair all day, and that person who has really zero physical activity seems to be disordered in the way that they're in the hunger versus satiety signals that their body is getting. And so that's, if I was going to give one thing to the exercise folks who want to, cure everything with exercise, I do think that there's some interesting thing going on there at the extraordinarily low end, at the very serious couch potato end, where your physiology is actually disordered because you're so inert.
Can I give a conflicting?
Yeah, please. I'd love to hear this. This is just sort of ideas,
Here's something else we don't normally correct for. Remember what I said earlier, which was we adapted in a calorie-scarce world, and appetite isn't a trait of negative selection in that case. And so appetite across the board could be the same. But the one thing that I think you would find in those studies is that because of those people who are normally associated with couch potatoes, be it those managers or the king, they also have an unequal access to food because of their status in society. And we see this in animals we keep as well, where the social structure of interacting with other humans or other animals is based upon this food exchange. And so one thing I've seen in all of these cases is you rarely ever see that in reverse. You rarely ever see people at the bottom of the peasant chain, if you will, in terms of food, those people being overweight. There are going to be some examples, but those being overweight versus the other ones. And we simply, I think, have this narrative of the toils of the worker, which I think has some truth. But what's really amazing is just how much work a human being can be. And again, I'm going to say that this supports your constrained energy expenditure, how much activity we can be and utilize that. And I'm going to say where I believe the energy goes. In other words, I believe, and this is what we described in oxidative priority, which is about why people gain, not how to lose. I believe the energy that we're not accounting for is the waste heat, because an extra 1,000 calories a day is 41.6 calories an hour. Now that you're an anthropologist that's measured a lot of metabolisms, what would it take to expend an extra 41 calories an hour over 24 hours versus over an hour for activity? So, okay, let's just say if we're going to do it over an hour, there's 1,000 or 2,000, 500 calories an hour is a lot of work, but it can be done, right? But the body just simply throwing off an extra 41 calories an hour by just a slight shift in RQ, if it's glucose or amino acids, excess amino acids that can't be stored beyond what the glycogen repletion is, or in the case of adipose or lipids, those lipids come in and they have literally an unlimited storage. So we don't have to get rid of any of those for any particular meal. Those only really need to be invoked in times of scarcity. So when we really look at alcohol, these main ones, alcohol, amino acids, and glucose, what does it take to shift that priority either by shift in RER or RQ, or let's just call it a feeding quotient. That's what we would call it, right? So shift it in that level, or shift in magnitude by 41 calories. You know that someone who you're measuring metabolism on, not on the doubly labeled water, because that's averaged over a longer period of time, which makes it a more gold standard for the kinds of things we're both interested in. But measuring it with calorimetry, indirect calorimetry, or even direct when they were doing it with thermometers, which was much more accurate in some sense, right? Because they could grab the CO2. What does it take to expend an extra 40 calories an hour? It's not much. Someone standing up, wiggling their arms easily does that. I mean, you've seen people just be excited in the lab and their metabolism just jump and they're like, crap. I wanted this baseline, which is why I think in some sense the double A label water, not only is it accurate and it's really the gold standard, but the other thing is that as a researcher, I mean, I can't afford to do it, but as a researcher, it's great because it's an integrated over time. And one of the things that I've done is looked at that integral, looked at how does respiratory quotient shift? Because when respiratory quotient shifts because of an explosive activity, remember, it's integrated over the entire curve. You don't have part of your body shifting in this way and part of it shifting that way. You have a whole integrated curve. And so, for example, if someone is sitting on a glucose drip in a hospital, and it's common that people that are incapacitated or in critical care, that they don't burn fat, but they keep them on a glucose drip all the time. So the body has to do something. I mean, you only need 4 grams of glucose a day, a little bit more than a teaspoon, or a little bit less than a teaspoon. I think a teaspoon's 5 grams. And so do you see what I'm trying to say is that part that we're not, even in that example, part of the problem that we're not really carefully controlling is that people have extra access to food, tend to eat that food. And we saw this even in Biosphere 2. There were certain people with food responsibilities, and somehow they didn't lose as much weight as the others. I'm not sure how that happened.
That's interesting. Right? Yeah. And I think that if you have access to food, and especially if it's delicious, you're in trouble. Yeah. You know, the Hadza folks we work with, and I think this would be true in other populations as well. I know the Hadza are the best, but there's this, talking about caricatures of what the past was like, or caricatures of what hunting and gathering is like. There's this idea that I hear a lot when I give talks about this stuff. Oh, well, they're starving. They can't, of course, they're nutritionally stressed. That's why they're so different, or what you don't expect. And the idea then is that, well, the reason they don't burn any more calories is because they basically are eating all the calories they can find. That's not true. First of all, they eat a lot of carbs, which surprises people. They eat a lot of honey and a lot of starch. Mm-hmm. That's right. And a typical Hadza woman, they go out in groups and they get tubers in the morning, and they might spend a few hours getting tubers. It's a lot of hard work. They come back and roast them up. But if they wanted to, if everybody was super hungry, they could spend an extra hour getting even more tubers, because the tubers are they're ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. They go back quickly. You never deplete them. And everybody could have another 500 calories of tubers every day if they wanted to. Right. But they don't. Because guess what? Eating 1,000 calories of tubers is already tough.
Tell them about the tubers they're doing, because when they're chewing these things, it's not like eating a baked potato from Wendy's, right? A loaded baked potato.
No, that's right.
They're chewing this and they're spitting out this large wad of fiber.
Yeah, they call it the quid. You spit out a lot of fiber, and you end up swallowing tons of fiber as well. So, it ends up being really filling. And when the berries that they eat are the same way. They're mostly seed. There's just a small rind on them, so you're filling up on this stuff. And but it's just the idea that they are calorie restricted in the sense that we would calorie restrict somebody in a lab, where we would actually say, no, you cannot have more than 1,800 calories today. Mm-hmm. That's not true. They actually could eat a lot more if they wanted to, but they don't want to. Why don't they want to? Well, because they're like you and me, like humans are humans. That's why that's why these cross population studies work, is because it's like asking how you would be if you grew up as a Hadza person, and you would grow up, hungry in the morning, go and get something to eat, and then you'd fill up on tubers and be done. Mm-hmm. Because you can't overeat tubers. I think that.
And everybody's laughing right now listening, because you don't know what I got started was this whole silly potato thing for different reasons. And it was because, just to go back in time and tell the story one more time, at the time when you were doing these studies and I was doing my work, all the people were this, I don't like protein, carbs, and fat as food groups. So I think I call this macro confusion. And so the idea is that just basically that fiber that you're saying and that starch or that simple sugar aren't isometabolic. And so since they're not metabolically similar, the same with amino acids and the same with lipids, they're not isometabolic. And since they're not isometabolic, grouping foods together by those gross numbers, because it's convenient on labels or convenient for studies, caused an enormous amount of confusion. And so I won't use those, which is why I said starch in the middle of there instead of carbs, because I don't want people to hear that word. I never use them. I don't use the C word. I don't drop the C bombs, the F bombs, or the P bombs, right? So I just stay away from those. But what is really important about what you're saying is that this idea that food is ubiquitously available, and what you said a little bit earlier in the conversation, which is hyperpalatable, we really have these real drives to eat more. So there's a boring factor to this. And in general, there's other things that people do. So back to your, again, I can't say this enough, life as being a simple game of turning energy into kids. You wiggle the least amount that you need to eat and mate and not poop where you sleep. Okay, that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. There's a lot of ways to play that game, but that's the essential rules.
Right.
That's right.
And so when we look at this, I really believe that what your work has started to do is pull out this idea that this excess activity is there. And just as you're saying, they don't want to eat extra because it's really all of those empty calories with the signaling or the programming. Oh, you got to eat more protein. I need this many grams of protein. Like, people are calculating. This is their bias. They don't know what they need. Or the idea that someone believes that there is something fundamentally different, that somehow there's no protein in plants. I mean, this is a crazy idea. Or that it's limited, or that it's not a complete protein. It's like, have you not studied Biology 101? Plants can't eat, and they have the same amino acids in their proteins that we do. They may be a different concentration of them, I'll agree, but in terms of complete protein, what the hell does that mean? And why would we still be talking about it in 2020? Of course you can live on a plant-based diet. People do it all the time. I'm not into the ideology of veganism. That's not really my thing. I don't do politics. I don't care about all that. But what I'm saying is, I can't imagine somebody graduating in 2020 and not realizing that every amino acid is in every whole plant food.
See, this is why people need to take more anthropology courses, because the strongest primates on the planet eat leaves all day. Right. That's how gorillas do it.
Right. Remember, we talked about that study in our email exchange where these. Why don't you tell them a little bit about that study, and I'll fill in on that, because it's really fun.
Oh, that's a fun one. Yeah. It's my colleague Jess Rothman, who's one of the leading primate nutritionists. She works with wild primates in Uganda mostly. But she's done amazing field work and has a really top-end nutrition lab at Hunter College, where she works, where I used to work with her before moving to Duke. She actually measures very carefully the nutritional intake of primates in the wild to kind of understand what their ecology is all about and how they meet their needs. And one of the fun things she found studying gorillas, who she works with a lot, was that they get tons of protein, more than anybody might expect, just from eating leaves all day. And that's not if you're a primatologist listening, you'll be rolling your eyes, because everybody knows that if you are in that field, how much protein are in leaves. But it was an eye opener, I think, more broadly, because people are surprised just how protein dense leaves can be.
Right. And what's really exciting about this, and why we referenced the paper, was the idea of sort of comparing this also with why is his name just slipping me? With Simpson's work on nutritional geometry, right? So when you look at this, what's really interesting is the prioritization of non-protein energy. What they were looking at is how they prioritized non-protein energy, and it was found that the non-protein energy intake was invariant throughout the year, which meant they had a similar amount of energy throughout a year. Goes right back to your hypothesis once again. But protein varied from fruit to primary leaved seasons. And in the fruit level, it would be about the equivalent of human lower protein diets when people want to do that. And when it was at the leaves level, it was equivalent to what we would call a high protein diet. Again, I hate those words, right? But just to put it out there, high protein diet for weight loss or whatever. And again, this doesn't square with this idea that flesh is protein and leaves aren't. But once you realize that every cell, again, you don't see this as an anthropologist as particularly surprising, so that you don't even talk about it. And when you hear it on the news, you just shrug your shoulder. And this is one of the reasons this stuff, we talked about those interviews we get with the media and how a lot of times they go right along, no matter what we say, they go right along with the same old narrative. And it's like, I can't be bothered defending all that stuff. I can't be bothered getting that correct. I'm just trying to get it in literature. There's no question that a person can live on a plant-based diet. This is not arguable, and you don't even have to plan it. Like, those guys don't plan their tuber to meat ratio. They don't care.
That's right. That's right.
And every anthropologist I've talked to, pretty much, says that. I mean, with her, one of the things I would love to have said is I loved your article, but then right at the end, you took this throwaway about animal versus plant protein and created a delineation. And it's like, everybody uses that one sentence in the paper, and I wish she hadn't said that, because even she, who was studying this closely, had the exact same bias. And I'm not saying that in a critical way. I'm saying that in a fun way to show that we all end up in that perspective if we don't stop and carefully think about it. And that's really what all of your work has shown, is that people just have this bias, but when they sit down and think through and work through your conclusions and your data, it's really hard to say anything else but, hey, we conserve energy, and that probably isn't unreasonable in a calorie scarce world.
No, that's right. And I got to say, it's been 10 long years.
Yeah, me too. And I've been here every step of the way. I've been with you. We haven't met until recently, but I've had the parallel life from the opposite side. I came specifically from the food side, right? And the dietary restriction side. And we, in the T.S. Eliot place, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for a very first time. And you and I seem to be on this track, and I think we're right.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I have to say, people say, well, what are you going to do next, or what's going to happen when you find out you're wrong? And what I say is, well, if we're wrong, we're wrong. But the data brought us here, and the data will bring us to the next place. And it's just fun to be in a kind of creative space, doing what feels like new stuff. And the other thing I'll say is, I think that we've finally gotten to the point where people are willing to acknowledge that this phenomenon is real. And now, I've seen people starting projects to try to understand, to drill down on, okay, well, why does this compensation happen? Why does this constraint or efficiency, however you want to talk about it, how does it happen? Why does it happen? And I think we're seeing a little bit of more open minds to these kind of phenomena where, and that's how science goes. People should be skeptical, quite frankly. People should be skeptical of new things. So I don't begrudge anybody that. But it's just fun to be in a place now where hopefully we're going to do some really fun science and figure out exactly what's going on. And, when it doesn't work, that's going to be interesting too. And when it does work, we're going to figure out how and why. And so I'm optimistic, I have to say.
Right. And I hope it's okay for me to say this for my audience, because they're going to love it. But one thing, I'm not sure if you've announced how publicly you've announced, but you actually are going to have a book coming out in March on this idea of calories and losing weight and staying healthy, but from this anthropological perspective. Talk a little bit about what you're planning to do. I don't know how much you can share at this point, but can you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, the book is going to cover a lot of the things that we've talked about and bring it up to, sort of today and where I think the interesting places to go are. But, it's a book that's meant to cover, it's called Burn, the new science of human metabolism. And we're excited about that. And that's just what it is. It's trying to look at metabolism again with kind of a new lens, and specifically an evolutionary lens. And I hope that people enjoy it. But we'll have to talk about the book in detail when it comes out. But we'll put it on their list.
But what you say is true. The data will go where the data goes. And now we have people like you that are looking at this in a much more rigorous way. And that's exciting. So it'll be really interesting to see how you put this in prose. so that we can start getting that conversation into the next level. It really needs to become part of that. And I think, having looked back at the history, I think it's about time for that readjustment. I watched what happened from 1790, from Lavoisier, until the early part of the 19th century. It was about a century. We're pretty much under the post-Justus von Liebig, von Voigt, Atwater kind of a Benedict for the next century. Dubois is the last person to sort of sets it in place around the 1930s. So really and truthfully, we're ready for that shift right now. And I think the work that you and I and other people have done in the last decade, especially on the foundation of the work like David Sinclair and others have done in health span and longevity, that we're due a major shift. And I think that this sort of thing, the constrained expenditure hypothesis, metabolic winter hypothesis, oxidative prior, I think these will all be part of a next generation model where people look at the intake and expenditure of energy independently of one another, not always inextricably intertwined. Because until Langworthy did those first experiments with activity and intake, it really wasn't done that way.
Right.
That started a methodology and an expectation and a whole research, and we learned a lot. Like you said, we collected a lot of data, and a lot of it's right. But now it's been summarized and distilled like a telephone game, to the point where once you started digging in, coming from an anthropology perspective, you weren't subject to all those biases. And I think a lot of your creative work comes from that. You're a crackpot till you hit the jackpot, right? I mean, it is that. And that's with Nate. It was the same thing. I said, so many of the things I said to him, he shrugged off as obvious, and I couldn't really get through that this is not obvious. And have you had some of that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually been really fun. Talking to like medical schools and nutrition centers with this work, and it's crossing over from somebody who is to get into the weeds of it. Most of my funding to date has come from National Science Foundation, and they fund basic research stuff that's long game kind of discovery based research. And crossing over from those kind of folks and those kind of labs to talk to people who are NIH line researchers, right? Who are much more, hey, this project has to help people's health today or tomorrow, and it's much more clinically based. And kind of the medical training versus the basic science training. That crossover has been so fun, but you're absolutely right. We get so much pushback when I get so much pushback when I talk about this stuff. And it's just built up, accumulated dogma, and not, again, and I don't mean that in a mean way, but when you're trying to learn how to be a doctor, you've got 20 years worth of material to cram into 4 years of medical school. Well, okay, so you kind of accept what seems obvious as obvious, and you don't really question things like the way that we think about metabolism. We think about it as in simple terms. But like you say, I think you're right. I think science is kind of constantly in this, constantly in a state of change, which is what's fun about science. But maybe we are due for a bigger change now, and hopefully we'll get people to kind of look at things differently.
Yeah, well, I'd love one day to have you. We're not too far away. I've made that drive a number of times from Huntsville when I was at Marshall to Duke for the labs. But I'd love one day for you to sit down in this library and look at this, because all these books were all thrown away. These books, I've collected them from all over the world, and these are all books that are no longer on university shelves. And even when they were, people weren't looking at them because they feel like they're outdated. And while a lot of their explanations are incorrect, their observations are their observations, and the data speaks back to a great way to end this with what you said. The data will take us where the data will take us. And you and I both came to this with a different kind of bias. We wanted to understand it. We had healthy skepticism, and we hadn't really learned it the other way. I won't even say the wrong way. We hadn't learned it the other way. And then when we started asking obvious questions, I am sure you got what I got a lot of times. Well, we really don't know that. wait a minute, we're really putting a lot of, like, this is a critical point. Yeah, I know, but we really kind of, we kind of assume this and that. And you guys extract so much information from such little amounts of data. You must be spinning in your head to know how much data we could collect, and yet it's not funded or not exploited compared to what an anthropologist is normally doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the entire budget for NSF anthropology is the size of, a handful of RL1 grants. And so we could do so much more if there was more of a concerted effort and budgetary priorities toward making this kind of human work a priority. It's tough, though, I mean, how do you say, well, we're going to do less cancer research and we're going to do more basic human ecology research? So I understand the tension and the difficulty there. But, it would have to be a grow the pot kind of thing and not cut anybody out. But, yeah, I think if we wanted to do it, if we really recognized how much if we're humble about what we don't really understand and how much there is to discover still about how our own bodies work, and people understood that, and maybe, if Congress understood that, there would be more money to do more of this kind of discovery-based research because there's so much to do.
Right. And also, don't forget, a lot of that research that we read about from a century ago or even 2 centuries ago was done through really private funding.
Yeah, that's right. Patronage kind of stuff.
It was more of this idea of philanthropy, right? And so, and the other thing is now, people like me who, working in my garage in Huntsville, Alabama, I can do legitimate research, just like when I had the academic shield of NASA and I had $1 million lab. I had a lot of things that were there, but I'm finding now that there's so much in the democratization of science in terms of access to information now, access to papers. It's so much easier to do this independently. And people like you, when I'm talking to a person like you or David or Drew, we're just talking ideas, and there isn't the academic gravitas that I think for a while shielded what serious work was from unserious work. And we have this opportunity, and Feynman started that with citizen scientists, right? But we have this opportunity now to do science that moves people because they're great thinkers all the way around. And as you and I are maybe examples of on the other side of it in terms of being disruptive, not being formally educated in that, but remember, science is a process. It's not facts. You didn't learn facts as an anthropologist. You didn't learn facts as an evolutionary biologist, and I didn't learn them as facts as a chemistry or biophysics. What we learned is a process to really untangle how our biases and our desire to see patterns cloud our view of what we're observing, because it's really there are no contradictions in nature. The contradictions exist in our observation and description of them. And so we really have a neat opportunity. We always used to talk at NASA about government, industry, and academia, but I think today it's really goes beyond that trichotomy. I think we could probably see government, industry, academia, and that private person, just the person who's passionate about it and would do it if they could do it for free.
Yeah,
they don't need to have that, because you think about your budget, you get a budget and the university takes half of it right away, or more than half in some cases. Yeah. And so, and I'm not downing universities, obviously, you know that there's the whole thing there, but let's just face it, there's a lot more information you can gather when I don't have to pay any salaries or overhead or anything. I mean, I pay my utility bill.
That's right.
Same calorimeter, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the one thing I been kind of pondering, it would be fun to sort of explore, is how do you what's the metabolic equivalent of 23andMe?
Yes.
How do you, there are so many good wearables now. I'm skeptical of using wearables to do expenditures, but they are very good at activity. And if you know that people's expenditures are, largely a function of lean mass, for example, and you had a good BIA scale that you could have on the cloud, and well, now wait a second, now all of a sudden, for the same $100 buy-in that people do with 23andMe, why couldn't you have 1 million people all, giving real-time data about, to the extent that we can do it, expenditure and activity and diet, and sort of see what happens, to go basically to be able to move from an N of 1 situation like you're able to do so successfully and say, well, how do we make that N of 1 million?
Yep.
And track the patterns and see what's really successful. And that would be really fun to do.
Well, Herman, this has been so much fun. I really want to have you back maybe once or twice before your book comes out. When it goes on pre-order on Amazon or whatever, let me know so I can send it out to all of our audience. But it's been so much fun talking to you about this. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. It was a really fun conversation. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you for joining me on this plant-based path to good health. It's always the food for your body and mind. So keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucer. For more details about the content in today's show or to contact Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.